Montana Territory, 1878. The sky was wide and blue over the Bitterroot Range when Gideon Ellery stepped off his horse and stared at the row of women standing outside the rail depot like surplus cattle. He hated this part, the buying. But the ranch was too big to run alone, and the winter had taken his last ranch hand and more than a few of his horses. He needed help. And maybe, if he was honest with himself, he was tired of all that silence come nightfall. The man beside him, some puffed-up agent from Missouri, cleared his throat. They are all agreeable, most come with a letter of reference. That one, he pointed, has none, too poor to even bring a trunk, but she is healthy. Gideon looked. She stood near the end, hands folded, dark brown hair pinned up tight, eyes locked on the horizon like she was somewhere else. "What's her name?" he asked. Rosalie Elkins. 19, father drank himself into debt, lost the farm, mother passed 2 years ago, no family left. Poor as dirt. Gideon's jaw tightened. She agreed to this. They all did, Mr. Ellery, no one was forced. He did not like the way the man said that. Gideon walked over slow, boots crunching gravel. Rosalie turned her head, looked him square in the eye. She did not flinch. "You got a say in where you go?" he asked. She nodded. "So they told me. I run cattle near Darby. Land is hard. Winters are harder. I need someone who can work. I do not need fancy." "I am not fancy," she said. Her voice was calm, but her hands were tight at her sides. "But I can cook, clean, sew, and ride, and I will not complain." Gideon studied her. "You got nothing." She shook her head once. "Just what I am wearing." He reached into his coat, pulled out the folded bills. "I will take her." The agent nodded. $250. Gideon paid without another word. Rosalie did not look at the money. The ride back took most of the day. He gave her his extra coat, watched her cradle a tin cup of coffee with both hands, and noticed how she kept her back straight even when the trail turned to rock. When they reached the ranch, the sun was low and gold behind the mountains. The house stood simple but sound, with a porch and one smoke trail rising from the chimney. "I will sleep in the barn," Gideon said. "You take the room inside. Warmth matters more for you." Rosalie looked at him. "You paid for me. You have no obligation to be kind." "I did not pay for a servant," he said. "I paid for help, that is all." She said nothing, only nodded and carried her small bundle inside. By midweek, Gideon noticed how she moved through the house like she had always belonged there. She scrubbed floors, cooked meals with what little they had left, and mended shirts with even stitches. But it was not just the work. She started tending the 2 orphaned calves without being asked. When the wind howled through the gaps in the barn wall, she stuffed them with rags. When the neighbor boy, Daniel, came by with a twisted ankle, she sat him down, cleaned the scrape, and wrapped it like she had done it 100 times. "She is a good woman," Daniel said later. "Real kind." Gideon could only nod. He knew that already. One night he found her outside, sitting beside the corral fence, wrapped in a quilt. He brought her coffee. "You cold?" he asked. She shook her head. "Just thinking." "About what?" She hesitated, then said, "My little brother, David, he died when he was 5. Fever took him fast. I used to sit with him like this after chores. He liked stars." Gideon sat beside her. "I lost my brother too. Same year the war ended, never made it back from Virginia." They sat quiet after that. The stars came out clear and close. "You are not what I expected," she said. "Neither are you." He looked over. "They said you were too poor to be worth much." She smiled, small but real. "And you bought me anyway. I think I got the better end of the deal." That night when he went to the barn, he could not stop thinking about how she had looked up at the sky, her face soft in the starlight. The next morning, he found warm bread on the table and his coat mended. By the end of the first month, the house felt alive again. He caught himself watching her laugh with Daniel, her hands dusted with flour, her eyes brighter than when she had first arrived. He had thought her poor, but she gave without asking. She worked without pride. She listened, truly listened, when he spoke. One evening after supper, he lingered in the kitchen while she dried the dishes. "You ever think about leaving?" he asked. Rosalie turned. "Why would I leave?" "I do not know. Maybe this place is too quiet." "Too rough." She looked at him a long time. "I do not mind quiet, and I have known rough, but no one ever looked after me the way you do." He stepped closer. "You deserve looking after." Her eyes flicked down, then up again. "Do I?" He reached for her hand, let his fingers brush against hers. You do, he said. She did not pull away. The next morning she came into the barn while he was feeding the horses. I want to stay, she said, but not just as help. Gideon dropped the feed sack. What do you want to be? She stepped close. Yours, he pulled her into his arms. You already are. And just like that, the quiet turned warm. The first snow came early that year, mid-October, with no warning in the sky until the flakes were already falling, slow and dry, across the pasture. Gideon had just finished shoring up the eastern fence when he saw Rosalie crossing the yard with a pail of ashes, her boots cutting narrow lines in the white. She didn't hurry, didn't seem to mind the cold, even as wind lifted her braid and turned her cheeks raw. Inside, she'd started laying quilts across the windows, one room at a time. She didn't ask him about it, just did it with that quiet, sure rhythm of hers. Gideon didn't question it either. He'd learned by now that she didn't waste a step. She found him in the shed that evening, digging out the old iron stove parts he hadn't touched since his father's time. The hinges were rusted, the door half stuck. You don't have to do that tonight, she said, brushing snow from the shoulders of her dress. You've been out since before breakfast, he knelt, wrench in hand. If we're gonna keep both rooms warm, I do. This stove's solid, just needs a new seal. She crouched beside him, her skirt hem soaking up the meltwater near the door. If you pass me the oilcloth, I can clean the grate. He handed it over without a word. The wind rattled the shed walls, and for a while they worked in the hush of snowfall and rusted metal. Later, over stew thickened with old root vegetables, she watched the flames shift behind the glass of the parlor stove, hands idle in her lap. You ever think about what you'd do if none of this had happened? She asked. Gideon leaned back in his chair, eyes on her profile. You mean if the war never came, if your father hadn't? He didn't finish the sentence. She shook her head. Not in that way, I mean, if I'd had a choice, if I'd stayed in Missouri, if you'd kept running this place alone. I'd still be eating salt pork out of the pan, he said dryly. She smiled, faint and crooked. And I'd probably still be waiting tables in a place that never had enough clean dishes. He set his spoon down. You don't miss it. The town? I miss music, she said after a pause. There was a man who played fiddle in the alley behind the dry goods store. Only came Saturdays. I used to linger when I could, just to hear it. He turned that over. I've got strings somewhere, belonged to my brother, might be brittle, but I could take a look. She looked up, startled. You play? Used to, he admitted. Not well. But I remember enough to pick through a tune. She didn't say thank you, just gave him that look again, the one that felt like being seen clean through. The days shortened fast. Snow settled thick along the fence rails. The cattle moved slower through the fields. Rosalie took to feeding the chickens by lantern light in the mornings, her breath drifting like smoke in the air. Gideon started carving a new latch for the cellar door, roughing it out beside the stove while she mended seams or wrote letters she never mailed. One night after chores were done and coffee was steeping, she brought out a small wooden box he hadn't known she kept. Inside was a square of muslin, and in it, a single button carved with a flower. It was on my mother's Sunday dress, she said, setting it beside the cup he'd poured for her. She let me keep it when we buried her. He didn't reach for it, just nodded slowly. I've kept it through everything, she said. Even when I sold the rest for Passage West. You don't need to give it up now. I'm not. I just wanted you to know where I come from. What I held on to. He looked at her then, really looked, and felt something settle inside him, quiet and heavy and certain. You want to stay through spring? He asked. She didn't blink. I want to stay as long as you'll have me. He reached across the table, took her hand. Her fingers were cold from the night air, but she didn't pull away. I want to build something with you, he said. Not just get by, not just make do. Her hand tightened around his. Then we start tomorrow, she said, and outside the wind softened, the night held steady. And in the warmth of that small room, something lasting began to take root. By late November, the road into Darby turned to ruts and half-frozen mud, and Gideon only made the trip when it couldn't be helped. Supplies were tighter than he liked, but the barn roof was holding, the cattle were feeding well, and Rosalie had taken to drying apple slices in the loft where the sun still reached. One morning, she stepped into the doorway with a strip of linen tied around her wrist. What happened? Gideon asked, setting down the hammer. Caught it on the kettle hook, she said, unwrapping the cloth to show a long, clean burn tracing the inside of her forearm. He crossed the room and took her arm gently. You should have called me. You were fixing the fence gate, she said. Didn't seem urgent. He fetched the salve from the cupboard without another word. She didn't flinch when he dabbed it on, though her eyes followed his hands carefully. You ever think of learning doctoring? She asked. Never had the patience for it, he said. But I've seen enough trail wounds to know what won't heal on its own. I think you'd be good at it. You're careful. He looked at her, the way she stood still while he wrapped fresh bandage around her wrist, like she decided he could be trusted not to hurt her. Careful's not the word most folks used for me, he said. Then they weren't watching close enough. He tied the end of the cloth and let her go. She didn't step back right away. That night they ate late. Gideon had brought back a sack of beans and a slab of smoked pork from town, and Rosalie had cooked them down with vinegar and pepper till the whole kitchen smelled like something worth remembering. Afterward, she kept her hands wrapped around her cup, even after the coffee had gone cold. You hear from anyone while you were in town? She asked. He shook his head. Just the postmaster, talking about how the new railway line might come through Missoula. Nothing for us. She looked down at her cup. I keep wondering if I should write back to the woman who arranged all this. Just let her know I'm all right. You think she'd care? I think she'd be surprised. Gideon leaned forward, elbows on his knees. Was she cruel? No, just tired, like someone who'd seen too many girls packed onto trains going nowhere good. She paused. She didn't think I'd last out here. He didn't say anything for a long while. You want paper? He asked finally. Ink's in the drawer. Rosalie nodded. I think I'd like to send her something better than silence. In the days that followed, she wrote in the early hours, before the fire caught fully and while the frost still clung to the inside of the windows. Gideon never read over her shoulder, but he noticed how her face softened when she folded the letter closed, like something old had settled. On the Tuesday after the first real freeze, a neighbor rode in from the east, an older man named Calvin who'd known Gideon's father. He came to borrow a brace and bit and stayed for supper, talking mostly of weather and wagon wheels until he turned to Rosalie. You keepin' this place steady, I see, he said, tipping his head toward the clean hearth and neat shelves. She met his eyes. I try. Looks like more than trying. He turned to Gideon. You do right marrying her. Gideon looked down at his bowl. We haven't made it official. Calvin raised an eyebrow. Well, you'd best. Word's already out. Folks talking like she's the reason this place looks lived in again. Rosalie's expression didn't change, but her hands went still. After Calvin left, she stood by the sink, drying each plate with slow care. You upset? Gideon asked. No, she said. Just thinking. About what? If you'd ever want to make it official, not for town talk, for us. He stepped behind her close enough to feel the warmth coming off her back. I've been wanting that, didn't know if you were ready. She turned then, the towel still in her hand. I think I've been ready since the night you fixed that stove with me. He smiled, soft and sure. Then let's not wait, she nodded, and her eyes didn't waver. That Sunday they stood before the preacher who came through every third week with his mule cart and worn Bible. Rosalie wore a plain blue dress she'd sewn from scraps. Gideon had shaved. There were no flowers, no music, no guests beyond Daniel and Calvin and the preacher's wife, who cried quietly behind her gloves. But when Gideon looked at Rosalie, he saw everything he hadn't known he needed. Steadiness, grace, and that quiet strength that never asked for praise. After the vows, when the preacher said they could kiss, Gideon touched her face and kissed her like it was the first breath after a long ride through dust. Later, as the light went gold across the edge of the pasture, they stood on the porch watching the sky change. You scared? He asked. No, she said, slipping her hand into his. Not anymore. They stayed like that until the cold nudged them inside, where the fire waited and the house felt full in a way neither of them had ever known before. By early December, the light barely lasted past supper, and the air in the valley held the sharp smell of frozen pine. The snow had crusted over the fields, thick enough now that Gideon strapped on the wide wooden shoes his father had carved decades ago to check the water troughs each morning. Rosalie stayed close to the house, tending to what could still be dried or stored, her sleeves rolled up, her wrist nearly healed. That afternoon, she set a basin of warm water near the hearth and laid out a shirt Gideon had worn near to tatters. She didn't ask if it could be saved, just threaded her needle and began, quiet as always. He watched her from the table where he was shaping new drawer runners, wood shavings curling at his boots. "You ever make anything for yourself?" he asked after a long stretch of silence. She glanced up. "Like what? Anything that wasn't needed?" "I used to draw," she said after a pause. "Charcoal on paper scraps, mostly horses, faces I remembered. I'd hide them under the mattress or in the stove when we moved." "You still draw?" She shook her head. "Haven't had the time." "Or the paper?" "I'll pick some up when I go to town next," he said, setting down his plane. "You ought to have something that's just yours." She didn't answer right away. Then softly, "I wouldn't know what to do with a gift like that. You'll remember." Later that week, Gideon rode out to check on Calvin's herd a few miles east. The man was near 70 and mostly kept to himself, but his son had gone to Helena for work, and Gideon had promised to look in before the worst of the storm season. He returned a day later, soaked to the knees and carrying a bundle wrapped in oilskin. Rosalie met him at the door, her hands raw from a day spent scrubbing the floorboards with lye. "You're limping," she said, taking his arm without hesitation. "Twisted something in the creek bed," he muttered. Frozen solid 1 minute, gave way the next. She helped him to the chair near the fire, peeled off his boots, then knelt to unwrap his calf. "You need to stop walking it off," she said, inspecting the swelling. "You're not 20 anymore." "I don't recall saying I was." She pressed a cloth to the bruise, then glanced at the bundle he'd dropped by the door. "That for me," he nodded. "Paper, and whatever pencils the general store had left." She stood and brought the parcel to the table. Her fingers worked the twine loose slow, almost hesitant. Inside were 3 folded sheaves, a tin of graphite and 1 stub of charcoal, worn but usable. She looked over at him, eyes steady but softened. "You remembered." "I said I would." She didn't speak again that night, just placed the tin beside the lamp and touched the edge of the paper like it might vanish if she blinked. The next morning, he found her outside, sitting on the porch rail with her knees drawn up, sketchbook in her lap and a shawl over her shoulders. He didn't interrupt, just watched her hand move, sure and light, until she noticed him and turned the page. "You spying on me?" she asked, smiling with her eyes. "Maybe." She held up the sheet. On it, she'd drawn his hands, not his face, not his figure, just his hands, one holding a fence post, the other gripping a hammer. "That what I look like to you?" he asked. She nodded. "Like someone who builds." He stepped closer, letting the cold bite at his collar. "You ever going to draw yourself?" She hesitated. "I never thought I had a face worth remembering." He frowned. "You do?" That evening, she sat beside him on the floor in front of the fire, her head resting against his leg, her sketch pad set aside. Snow tapped against the windows, not hard but constant. "Did you ever want children?" she asked, voice low against the cotton of his trousers. "I did," he said. "When I was younger, before the war, before everything got too uncertain, I think I might," she said. "Not now, not tomorrow, but one day, if it was with someone I trusted." He ran his hand through her hair slowly, the fire casting her face in warm gold. "You've got that now," he said, "whether we add more to it or not." She didn't answer, but her fingers curled into the edge of his shirt like a promise. The days passed quiet after that, but full. She baked cornbread with dried sage she found in the cupboard, and he replaced the broken hinge on the barn door. They didn't speak of the future often, but it hung between them in the way she rested her hand on his shoulder when passing, in the way he drew the quilts higher on her side each night. One morning, she showed him a sketch of the house not as it was, but as it could be, with a second room and a garden fence. "Think we could manage that?" she asked. He looked at her face, then at the lines on the paper. "With you," he said. "I think we can manage anything." The thaw came slow, seeping into the ground by degrees until the snow retreated in patches across the pasture like an old quilt being pulled back. Mud thickened along the west trail, and the creek behind the barn began to murmur again beneath its thinning ice. Rosalie stood at the back stoop one morning, sleeves rolled to her elbows, watching clouds drift low over the hills. She had always been early to rise, but now she lingered longer by the window, often resting a hand against her middle when she thought no one saw. Gideon noticed. He didn't ask, not right away. Instead, he added a rail to the porch where the step had loosened and made a habit of keeping the fire lit before she came down for breakfast. He'd never had to ask how she felt. He could read it in the way she moved, in how her breath caught when she bent too quickly, or how her appetite shifted with the turning of the moon. One evening, after supper, she placed a folded scrap of cotton on the table between them. Inside was a small knitted cap, uneven in places but soft and clearly made with care. "I thought it was time you knew for certain," she said. Gideon held the cap in his hands for a long time before speaking. "You sure? I wouldn't have shown you if I wasn't." He looked up at her. "Are you all right with it?" "I'm more than all right," she said. "I wasn't expecting it, but I'm not afraid." He reached across the table, resting his hand lightly on hers. "Then neither am I." The next weeks passed in a rhythm neither had known before. Rosalie worked slower but never idle. She took to stitching tiny garments in the afternoons, her work basket filling with soft muslin and wool she bartered from the woman who kept sheep near the bend in the road. Gideon began clearing the old shed behind the house, the one his father had once used to store tack and seed. He didn't say what it was for at first, but she knew. He lined the walls with pine, patched the leaks, and built a crib from lumber he'd saved for years. Calvin stopped by in late April, bringing a sack of oat grain and 2 hens that laid brown eggs, their shells mottled like river stones. "You'll need the extra," he said, glancing at Rosalie's rounded shape. "And I figure you've got enough to think on without worrying over feed." Gideon nodded, but it was Rosalie who stepped forward and embraced the old man, her face pressed briefly against his worn collar. Calvin blinked, then patted her back with a gentleness that surprised them both. "I never thought I'd have this," she said that night, curled beside Gideon beneath the quilt. "Not just the child, this whole life." He brushed a strand of hair from her cheek. "You built it. You made this place into something worth coming home to. I didn't do it alone. You didn't have to." In early May, the wildflowers returned to the edges of the property's small blue blossoms that clung low to the ground, stubborn and full of color. Rosalie stopped to gather them one morning, tucking a few into the windowsill above the kitchen basin. She hummed softly as she worked, a tune Gideon didn't recognize, but it stayed with him all the same. The baby came on a warm night after a long day of scattered rain. Rosalie's labor was hard but steady, and Gideon stayed close, fetching water, holding her hand when she allowed it, listening to every breath like it might be her last. The midwife, a quiet woman from the North Road, moved with practiced ease, her voice low and calm. At just past midnight, they heard the first cry, a sharp, clear wail that cut through the hush like birdsong at dawn. A girl, the midwife said, healthy and strong. Rosalie wept, not from pain but from something deeper, and Gideon held her as the baby was placed in her arms. "She's beautiful," he whispered, voice unsteady. Rosalie nodded. "She's everything." They named her Clara after Rosalie's mother. Gideon built a rocker the next week, carving small vines into the arms, not for show but so Clara would have something to trace when she grew curious. Rosalie planted herbs outside the kitchen door, one hand always steadying the sling against her chest. In the months that followed, the ranch thrived. Daniel came by with his new wife and offered to help with branding. Calvin dropped off seed potatoes and stayed to hold Clara while Rosalie baked bread. The house never felt crowded, only full. One afternoon in late summer, Gideon returned from the creek with a bucket of trout and found Rosalie sitting beneath the cottonwood tree, Clara asleep in her arms. The light dappled through the leaves, catching in her hair, and for a long moment he simply watched them, the peace of it settling over him like a blanket. "You're staring," Rosalie said without looking up. "I am. Why? Because I can't quite believe it's all real." She turned her face toward him, eyes warm. "It is, and it's ours." He sat down beside her, leaning back against the tree. Clara stirred but didn't wake. "You ever think about what comes next?" he asked. Rosalie nodded. "I think about her first steps, about planting a bigger garden. I think about more laughter in these walls." He reached for her hand. "I think about growing old with you." She smiled, the kind that reached every part of her. "You're already halfway there," he laughed, and the sound rolled easy through the branches overhead. And there they stayed, beneath the wide Montana sky, with the scent of earth and milkweed in the air, and the sound of their daughter breathing soft between them. Their life, once born of necessity and silence, had grown into something rooted and good. Not without struggle, but full of grace. Every hard-earned inch of it, and they lived there together in a home made strong by love and time, their days unfolding gently, one into the next.